You are about to enter a new world, and you will never view entertainment in the same way again. This is Popcorn Theology.
Well, so we've talked about, I think the sexy vampire is a good transition as we talk about maybe reasons that aren't so interesting or noble or virtuous. We mentioned one objection to horror is that the only attraction is, you're attracted to evil. It's just an attraction to the occult or attraction to violence or attraction to that gore for just disgusting reasons. So having enjoyed, Mike, and even contributed to the horror genre, I'm imagining what are the common objections that you guys have had to field over the years related to horror? Mike, you obviously had to field some and probably do at a regular basis and wrote a book about some of them. So
yes.
What are they? If we can sort of list them off.
Well, obviously the most common is that, one of the most common, I guess, for me, is that watching horror or evil is a gateway to darkness. It opens a portal, in a sense, to darkness and to evil. And there can be some truth to that. Absolutely. But in the same sense, watching romance can be a portal to evil too. I joked about at one of the conferences that I taught at that if the devil was really going to appear and deceive people, he could show up as an Amish milkmaid. That'd be the perfect disguise. And we tend to think of the devil, when the devil wants to show up, he's going to show up with sulfur and horns. It's like, the devil, run. It's like, in reality, wouldn't the devil show up in, as like the Bible says, an angel of light and stuff? So yeah. The argument that horror can be a tool for evil or can lead to evil, I think is absolutely true. I think it's absolutely true. But I'd say that about all kinds of genres. They can present wrong conceptions about life, about love, about ourselves, about the nature of reality, about God. That's not an accusation that can just be leveled at horror,
Right.
And then also you've got the whole idea, which is very common in people objecting to horror, is the idea that I think it's more of like a fundamentalist idea, because evangelicalism is really tethered to early fundamentalism in a lot of ways. But the whole fundamentalist idea that certain things are evil, dancing is evil. You can't get, you got to stay a foot away. If you're going to dance, you got to be a foot away from your partner. Or smoking is evil. Cigars are evil, Joe. And then there's all kinds of things. Drinking is evil, and music, rock music's evil. In other words, that things are evil, and there's this certain kind of a touch not, taste not aesthetic that is attached to a lot of objections to horror. One of the most linked, one of the posts on my website that gets some of the most traffic is an older post called "Are Skulls an Anti-Christian Symbol?" For some reason, that thing just took off. I don't know why, but I wrote it because I have some skulls in my office. Well, at some random posts I put on Facebook, and people saw the skulls and they said, "Don't you know that skulls are evil?" And I said, "Really? I have one in my head, and so do you. When do they become evil, actually?" And anyway, that position is representative of this bigger position that things are evil, that watching this movie, that seeing this image, that having that object in your office is an invitation to evil. And those are important and deep and potentially complex subjects to deal with. But I find that that's kind of one of those objections as well to horror all the time. It's like watching that watching them say that, hearing that incantation, watching that symbolism is going to lead to horror. And it's that, I think it's kind of a fundamentalist kind of a restriction,
Well, I think people even go further than that a little bit sometimes. I think when they talk about you're opening a portal, like I would equate that, if you're opening a portal to temptation, reading a romance, some of these Harlequin romance novels, and so it's an invitation to temptation. Do we think some people, it seems, are saying? I'm trying to remember something even about the original Exorcist movie. People, I think a famous minister at the time said there's like demons are in the celluloid, They legitimately think that somehow, it doesn't just open a portal to temptation. Somehow, watching a story about demons somehow lets them get to you in some physical or spiritual way, and that seems problematic to me, because then I shouldn't read scriptures talking about evil spirits either, or we shouldn't read Frank Peretti for that matter. I'd say objects aren't evil, and I was even say, well, thinking about a demon or thinking that they're real. Actually, I probably should be thinking that they're real. And that's the famous C.S. Lewis quote. It's we shouldn't think about them overly much, but I'll butcher his quote. But we think about them. We need to think about them and be aware of them. As we said earlier in previous segment, there are dragons. So, Joe, what about you? What have people thrown at you over the years?
Yeah, in addition to all that, because I've heard that from time to time. Probably the most common thing that, and the most challenging, I don't think it is. I think it misunderstands the issue. But I think the best argument that they throw is Philippians 4:8, which is set your mind on the things that are good, right? So whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is lovely, whatever is just, whatever is commendable, all that stuff. Think about those things. And how are you thinking about those things if you're filling your mind with all of that darkness? And I mean, obviously, that's a very superficial reading of that passage, because if we cannot contemplate, consider, interact with, and engage in dark realities, then we have to leave the world. There just isn't. My life is not a bright, happy, sunshiny reality. It's just not. So I have to engage in the dark things. And whatever is true is not the same thing as whatever is lovely. Right? Things that are true can be very dark and very hard and very painful.
Yeah, great point.
So these are things that we have to engage in. And the truth is when I watch a horror movie or listen to music or do any of those things, I am coming at it with a biblical theological worldview by which I make sense of it. And even if the author, the writers, the creators, even if they don't have the same sense, we're still both interacting with the same themes or ideas. And so I come away thinking about the things that are true and noble and righteous, even if they haven't been presenting those things. So, that's the most common thing. That's probably the most common biblical argument, that makes some sense. I mean, it's just bad demonology, people. That's going to open a portal and a demon's going to get in your head if you all that. But that is probably the most Bible college-y sort of a thing I got when I was going to Moody.
Yeah, it's just funny for me because when I pastored a church, I dealt with far more people that were being influenced negatively, not from horror films, but like Harlequin romances, like you said, that there was just Hallmark romances, whereas there's this anesthetized, pure concept of life and romance and things like this. And it's just, that stuff can really do damage to people's values or expectations. Let's put it that way. And so it's weird. I didn't really deal with a lot of people that, I need counseling. I've watched, too many horror movies. Not that can't be an issue, but It seems like there was more whose values were misaligned because of other cultural products than horror.
Well, see,
I could also say that I just wanted to say that, I think Christian fiction has also done a great deal of damage because Christian music, there's great Christian writers and musicians out there, but most aren't. And some of the stuff that's put out is bad, and it leads people in a bad way. So, like, let's not pretend like, oh, well, those pagans that wrote about, Satan. They don't. It's like everybody has the potential to bring a lot of misinformation to the table, and Christians have certainly done their fair share.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
yeah.
I think we can all agree when Harlequin meets horror, we get Twilight, and that is terrible. It should be
objectively.
that needs
objectively
to go.
wrong.
That's objectively right. Yeah.
I like it. Harlequin meets horror.
Yeah, but so that being said, that's a great point, Joe, and kind of makes me think. So if there's a lot of bad Christian music and a lot of bad Christian writing, then surely we have to say there are places where there's bad horror that maybe isn't edifying, or there's bad, either it's just poorly made, or it actually, when do you think the cautions have substance? If we're going to throw a bone to any of these cautions, when and where would we actually, in a good way, say, yes, this should be something we take as caution, or actually when a film horror films go here or there, maybe it's not worth the time. Where do you get, what bones would you throw to the cautions, I guess? Bones being skulls, I guess, because
I know for me, I have issues with gore, Now, some movies, I just watched a movie the other day. I think it's a Netflix film called The Passenger. And I think it's really worth watching, but there's a tremendous amount of gore. I was just shocked that the ending, spoiler, is fairly redemptive. And that kind of blew me away. I wouldn't even mention the movie if I hadn't seen that last, because I was ready to turn it off. It was just so gory. And for me personally, gore is one of those things I have a very low tolerance for, especially when it's purely exploitative and it doesn't. Saving Private Ryan had gore, and that gore was necessary to the telling of the story. But something like Hostel, I have a little bit of hard time with that, because I'm not sure where that's going, and I'm not sure if that's stroking the right vibes inside of me, if that's the way I can put it. I just don't need to see people taking too much joy in dismembering others. So for me, a gore is one of those elements of horror where I'd say, I'd be careful watching that. Now, one caveat, and this is going to be weird, but I remember, because I've shared this position before about gore, I was contacted privately by someone who said they had been in a horrible auto accident as a child. And she said that movies like Faces of Death and movies where there was gore and depictions of brutal dismemberments were actually cathartic for her.
Weird.
Now, listen, she's the only person that's ever told me that, but I've logged it because there may be an exception out there. Someone might get something positive out of gore, but for me personally, I struggle with films that are explicitly gory just for the sake of shock.
Yeah, well, I think that I would put some credence to that, although I actually did enjoy Hostel. But that was, I felt watching it, for me, I felt like that one kind of got at something we talked about a little bit earlier when you were talking about surviving or overcoming an experience, the character that escapes, just like, wow, that, yes, it was hard to watch it endure, but thinking about having to endure it, but then actually escaping, like the catharsis can be there. But I am generally not disposed to slasher, a lot of the slasher stuff, or just the home invasion, where there's lots of just seeing the body parts fly by some crazy killer. I find a harder time finding movies that really have a redemptive theme in them, and so usually don't steer. I only, if I hear recommendations, then I go check them out. But what about you, Joe? Where are some of the cautions and concerns got some validity?
You guys are babies. No, I'm kidding.
He owns the whole Hostel series. All right.
like for me, Saw 1, good.
Right. Same with me. It
just kind of went off.
Same with me.
It became about the deaths instead of
the bigger offense. The bigger offenses in the Saw franchise was not the gore; it was the writing. But because Saw was brilliant, James Wan is the man. Speaking of James Wan and gory stuff, I'm not opposed to gore, and I think what the point that you actually are driving is that there is a line. But the line is somewhat subjective because what crosses a line for me is not going to cross a line for you, and vice versa. Right. I don't think any topic is off limits in comedy or in fiction. I think how you present it is where the line gets crossed. Objectively, I think you can sometimes cross a line objectively. So I think there are objective lines that I just go, absolutely not. I'm not doing that. And gore is not that for me. But how it would be presented. Right. So for example, a woman can be raped in a film. If it is depicted in any way, I cannot physically do it because I want to murder my fellow man in that moment. I know it's fake. I just can't do it. So there are lines, and I think you have to know, like, if you don't have a line, I think there's an issue. I think there's a problem there.
Good point.
A subjective, personal, like, I just don't go there. So for me, it's not going to be gore, but it is how it is presented. And speaking of gore, James Wan, I think, by the way, he's doing the Creature from Black Lagoon remake. It's the movie that everybody wrongly hates, because I don't think they understand giallo and Italian horror and all that, but they wrongly hate this movie. It's Malignant. And it is
wonderful film.
One of my favorite, if not my favorite, James Wan film. It is, if you understand giallo horror and you watch this, you will just love it. And there is so much to appreciate it in terms of its filmmaking and everything else. And it's bananas bonkers at the same time without spoiling anything. Oh my goodness, that was a gory movie. And the gore in that, because it's extremely bloody, the gore in that is funny. It is designed to not be realistic. No Country for Old Men, that violence is terrifying and realistic. The violence in this is not. It's cartoony and wild and a good time. So they're serving different purposes. I think there are lines. Most of them are subjective. Some of them are objective. But most of us are going to wind up disagreeing.
It's actually surprising to me to find how much more easily this up-and-coming generation deals with gore. And I think it probably relates more to video games than reading or even going to movies. You watch a video game like Gears of War or something like that, where you're chainsawing aliens and there's just stuff flying over it. Preteen video games are about as gory as The Evil Dead.
And they've also seen
these days,
but they've also watched ISIS behead people on the internet at 10 years old. Like, these kids are seeing everything on there. So it's, to go to the movies and go, like, gore isn't a problem because sex on screen is far more offensive to me. Like, nudity on film is far more offensive to me than gore, because nudity is real, gore is not. It is absolutely pretend and make believe. Nobody is hurt, but those boobs are real, and I don't need to be seeing it. So it's like I gotta skip ahead, or I just watched a show with my son, and I'm like, this is gonna be a great movie. He's been asking to see it. I go, you can't watch it. There's a boob scene in it. You don't do that. But he said, well, what do you do? And I go, well, I will skip ahead. And he said, could we do that? And I said, absolutely. So when that part of the thing came on, I go, all right, hang on. Here we go. Now we can continue with the story, because it was such a ridiculous, needless thing that didn't contribute.
I'm glad you mentioned.
That's interesting.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah.
That's interesting to me because in some ways the boobs would be less offensive to me. Not that I watch boobs all the time, but boobs would be less offensive than slicing that same woman open and pulling her entrails out. I think there's something about that. In other words, it is more natural for a man to see a man and a woman have, let's say, normal sex. If there's boobs involved, okay, that's normal. Than having the man disembowel her. There's something deeply evil or unnatural about that. Whereas the sexual elements, if they're portrayed in a proper context, are a little more, I don't know if I could say healthy. You know what I mean? So, but again,
my pushback would be that you're dealing it from the perspective of the story, whereas I'm thinking about it in terms of the actual exploitation of an individual. That actress is exploited, and we are taking advantage of her and treating her as something less than we should when we are like, hey, yeah, you can go ahead and strip down for this role. I think there is so I'm looking at it from this angle, not the story part, because husbands and wives should have awesome sex together. That's something to celebrate. But I'm like thinking about like, oh, like I know actresses, when they are getting murdered, they're having a blast. They're having a good time. Like, oh, the special effects is so fun. And I've heard dozens of actresses say the sex scenes were brutally uncomfortable and I felt taken advantage of. And so that's more what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
Well, I think good points. When we go back to the objections to horror, I think for a long time, I think 80s and 80s, I think predominantly,
yes,
70s and 80s, there was a lot of nudity in horror that you didn't necessarily get to see in a lot of other genres. But all the other genres that I know have caught up. So it used to be that
pulling back. Horror has pulled back on the nudity, unless they're doing an homage, unless they're like remaking something and they want to go 80s style. They've pulled back on it.
So I find that really interesting. Well, it used to be a very common objection was like, oh, it's always just teens go out in the woods and the girls take their tops off and different things. And it's like, well, yeah, that was very true in the 80s and a lot of this straight to VHS days. And so, but yeah, now that's just irrelevant because now you can watch, so you can go on and watch Game of Thrones. You can watch every genre has this stuff in it now. And so that objection for me kind of fell by the wayside. But that's some good debate. I like that about what bothers us or what, and there is that sort of side of what's exploiting the people making the pieces and what's on the other side. Then what do we have to know in terms of our limits? I like the everybody needs a line or something's wrong. I think that's a really good point.
Yeah.
If you don't have one, if you don't have a filter, if you don't know where you need to stop, because I mean, even to your past, Mike, when you were talking about it, I could see someone dealing with Ouija boards and dealing with the occult in their past who could either find it really uncomfortable to watch some of that and have it revive things that happened, or I could see it the other way. It could be alluring to. May have been something fun about doing that seance. Maybe I want to do them again. Like I could see some people just needing a full stop, kind of like the alcoholic just can't go to the bar.
Meat sacrifice to idols.
Yeah, and there really is a sense of Christian liberty that we need to discuss, or is part of the discussion of issues like this. It's easy to make blanket statements and say, no one should watch this, no one should read that. And maybe in some cases that's true, but there's an argument to be made for Christian liberty that, when it comes to entertainment and pop culture, we might be able to draw back our criticisms at some point and give people the freedom to make up their own mind. But again, that's kind of a squishy line potentially, because people then could say, well, hey, I'm fine with boobs, or I'm fine with, gutting someone, know? So it's like, at some point, that'd be a great discussion, to have is, what are those Mike, lines, and where do you give people freedom?
Mike, you need to write an article called Boobs and Bowels. And it can be about like, how do we draw the line between the disembowelment of people or the boobs that are shown on screen, right?
There we go. Well, okay, that's all the negative stuff. The